Well, thank you all so much for joining me today. I basically got the inspiration from this talk by visiting last semester, and I attended Dr. Backen's lecture about sort of philosophy and science, and I thought, what could I contribute to a contribution in terms of science and mathematics? And I thought, well, maybe I could start looking at what films are doing and what films have to say about science and our perceptions of science. So I'm going to be going over about 85 films today, and I'm starting my timer now. Really excited to take you kind of a whirlwind tour through cinema. There's going to be some spoilers here, but the movies are worth seeing for what they are. I tell my students I'm a huge spoiler alert kind of guy, only because we can't talk about the film unless we can talk about the film. But it's not necessarily required for you to have seen the films. You might want to make a note of things that seem interesting here as we go forward. So there's some science in cinema and there's some cinema in science. And I'm here today to kind of bridge that conversation, which is sometimes a miscommunication between those fields. And they're emerging fields. There is exploration through art, there is exploration through science. They're both ways of understanding our world. And they also both emerged during largely the 20th century. Because we have most of our modern fields of science and most of what we get in terms of filmmaking from the same time period. And in fact, they actually overlap quite a bit with the photochemical elements that go into actually producing film, with the physics that go into creating camera lenses, and now with all of the digital technology necessary to create imaging, both for science and for filmmaking. So there is some collaboration there from the outset. There are some fundamental questions that science and cinema asks, which is what could be done, and more importantly, what should be done. But we need to recognize that cinema is a popular medium and that it could in some ways misrepresent science. So science is known for its academic publications, its scholarly work, its conferences. Scientists really practice a very high standard of ethics for a fairly reserved, some would say elite community. But filmmaking is really designed for the masses. Most films are designed for the general public. And so when science is conveyed in cinema, we might be getting a dumbed down or distorted version of the science. So we'll lay that on the table from the outset. I would also argue that in some ways science has become a plot device. So science in quotes, meaning that it is used to advance the story. Things that we wouldn't otherwise understand, appreciate, or suspend our disbelief with regard to filmmaking is something that we can put science in the movie to explain. And in some ways, we live in a more secular society so that we can't really get away with saying that it's magic or that it's miracles that are causing this amazing spectacle in the film, but we can say that it's science, right? So what's my methodology? Well, I surveyed and compiled notable science fiction films that inform and explore issues of scientific importance through narrative storytelling. I tried to look at a whole range of films and take a step back and figure out what are some common categories that I'm finding here. I'd like to distinguish between strict factual comparison and broader thematic analysis. And by that I mean that we want to look at what the film is saying overall and not necessarily that this aspect of physics in this film is probably incorrect. We'll concede that that's probably incorrect. But what is the film in a bigger sense saying about science? I've tried to limit it to American cinema, which includes co-productions, films that were funded and shot in many areas. But I have made a few exceptions because I couldn't avoid a few films. I'd like to consider sequels and remakes, of which there are many, but only television if it's been adapted for feature-length film. We could do an entire talk just about television and science therein. I'd like to look at films within the context of their era of production relative to scientific knowledge. So the film doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's kind of a science pun. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's something that's part of a broader conversation we're having as a society. So knowing when a film is made helps us to understand what it might be saying. And then also to recognize that science fiction films often deal with many fields of science. But what I'm going to try and focus on is one or two core areas that that film really hinges upon for its thematic conveyance for us. So there are many aspects of a film's science fiction that we won't look at today, per se. All right, so let's start with the future of transportation, because we wouldn't have science fiction without flying cars, without futuristic cities. So let's just start there. The future of transportation, of course, in films like The Fifth Element, we have the flying cars. But sometimes the future is not quite as utopian in that sense. In fact, it might be more dystopian. It might not be an ideal future. So films like Mad Max, where we have an energy crisis, we have these roving gangs in the deserts of some futuristic Australia in which there is a lot of violence and mayhem. And it might even become as bad as a film like The Road, where all the main character has is a shopping cart for his transportation. So a fundamental question we should ask ourselves of any science fiction narrative is that, has society advanced or deteriorated? And I put advanced in quotes because sometimes we see science fiction where the future looks very bright, but there are problems. There are things that we forgot about or left behind. But we can also look at the opportunity science fiction presents to explore within our planet and within ourselves. Films like Journey to the Center of the Earth. Now, I don't know, do we have any Earth scientists here that can talk about this? Because the film depicts giant reptiles and all sorts of other creatures living in the center of the Earth. I don't know if you've been down there to check this out.
It would be very hot.
Okay, probably pretty hot, right? So that's one example. We also, a couple of years later, have Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, another example of deep sea exploration using modern science to see areas of our planet we've never seen before. And then we have a silly comedy film like Inner Space, in which a character gets shrunk down into the size of a syringe and injected into another person, and he goes around inside that person's body. So the future of transportation may have an inner landscape as well. But let's talk about space exploration, because I think when we talk about science, this is an area that we often like to look at. So space exploration is interesting because in the course of the history of cinema, we've also seen great advances in space exploration. We have the famous 1902 film, which is not American, that's my first concession, A Trip to the Moon, a wonderful short film you should all see if you haven't. And it's most famous, of course, for the rocket landing on and hitting the moon right in the face. Now, I don't know if we have anyone who can verify. It's probably not how it worked out. But then we go on to a film like Destination Moon, which takes the subject somewhat more seriously, an actual concerted effort to make it to the moon. And the film made in 1950 was right around the era where we were having a real conversation culturally, scientifically, about space exploration, and about 2 decades later, we ended up arriving on the moon. And then we have a film like Forbidden Planet, which really uses the concept of outer space to produce a fantasy that is grounded in scientific possibility. So faraway worlds could contain all of the fantastic life that is depicted in a film like this. We just don't know. So it becomes more plausible because it is grounded in some sort of science, quote unquote. Then we get this idea that space is a new frontier, and that this is a narrative device. But it also explores the concept of political conflict. So in a way, the more things change, the more things stay the same. That even though we can travel to faraway galaxies, it turns out we have some of the same conflicts that we see around the world today in terms of cultural misunderstandings, consolidation, and competing for power. And so films like Stargate, Star Wars, Star Trek, in different ways all handle this concept of how do we get along as an intergalactic society, much in the same way we ask that question today about our global society. Space exploration can also evoke the idea of inner struggle, almost an existential struggle, the question of personal survival and the purpose of existence. When the universe is so vast, what does that tell us about ourselves and our place in the universe? A film like Sunshine, where the characters are on a voyage to the sun to actually basically detonate a nuclear device in the sun to recharge it because it's dying and the Earth, of course, is getting very cold. And then the film Gravity, which basically has a fairly realistic look at what life in space would be like, where you really could drift off into silence and there's nothing to literally ground you in your own life. But space exploration also includes the prospect of contributing real science to the film. And Interstellar is not the only film, but probably the most recent and remarkable film to do this, because Caltech theoretical physicist Kip Thorne actually contributed to the film in modeling how a black hole distorts light, looking at how light would behave in the kind of environment around wormholes or around black holes. I have a video clip to help illustrate this better, so hopefully this is kind of good insight into this.
We're still pioneers. We've barely begun. Our greatest accomplishments cannot be behind us, because our destiny lies above us.
The initial impetus for the project had been to say, why not examine real possibilities? Why not actually look at the real science there?
Luckily, we had Kip, and Kip is the foremost authority on all things gravitational.
The warping of space inside here scatters some of it back, light scattering off of the surface of a rippled ocean. Neither wormholes nor black holes have been depicted in any Hollywood movie in the way that they actually would appear. This is the first time that the depiction began with Einstein's general relativity equations.
The visual effects department under Paul Franklin and everybody at Double Negative took Kip's mathematical data and they created real visual representations of what a black hole is meant to look like.
The collaboration has produced visualization of things which nobody had ever managed to do before. We potentially may have discovered a couple of new things that were lurking there inside the mathematics, inside the physics.
I worked out the equations that would enable him to do the gravitational lensing. And so you have light that comes from a star behind a black hole. It may come in, go around the black hole several times, and then come to the camera. And so you wind up with several different images of the star.
The black hole warps the space so much, it just looks like you're looking at a strange sort of funnel in the sky with this intensely black circle at the middle of it. But the gravity of the black hole draws in all the matter from the surrounding universe. And this spins out into a giant disk around the central sphere. And as it whirls in towards the center, the gas gets hotter and hotter. And this thing, the accretion disk around it, shines brilliantly. And then we found that if you then render this whole thing, you visualize it all through this extraordinary gravitational lens, the gravity twists this glowing disk of gas into weird shapes, and you get this extraordinary sort of rainbow of fire across the top of the black hole.
And I saw this disk wrap up over the black hole and under the black hole. I'd known it intellectually, but knowing it intellectually is completely different than seeing it, than feeling it.
We had determined when we started down this road that if it didn't look like something that would be comprehensible to the audience, we would have to manipulate it in some way. But what we found was, as long as we didn't change the point of view too much of the camera position, we could get some very understandable tactile imagery from those equations. They were constantly surprising. Spoke to the maxim that, truth can be stranger than fiction.
We're going to write several technical papers about this. One aimed at the astrophysics community, and then something for the computer graphics community, saying, here are some things that we've discovered about gravitational lensing by rapidly spinning black holes that we never knew before. So this collaboration isn't over until we've given some sense of the things that we've learned.
I'm hoping in some sense that this project, this collaboration, will actually become the model for future science fiction films, because as you see in this clip, the process underwent to create the black hole for the film ended up generating new scientific data, because the computing power that was afforded to this Hollywood production exceeded that than anyone had had access to before. So Hollywood was now in the process of doing some real science under the guidance of scientists to generate data that had never before been seen. So now let's move on to time travel. Now time travel is kind of problematic for a number of reasons, the main one of which is that we don't have a lot in science to better understand how time travel would work other than what we just talked about with regard to black holes and how perceptions of time may vary in those specific instances. But with regard to time travel, we have a fascinating but mostly fanciful proposition at our hands. Films like The Time Machine, where a character advances into the future to discover a somewhat dystopian society where we have different groups of genetic offshoots of humanity who are competing and at war with each other, to a film like Back to the Future and its subsequent sequels, where the main character's own existence is predicated upon replicating the conditions from 1955 to 1985, getting his parents to meet and fall in love, or he won't exist again. So that's the problem that time travel presents us with. And it can make for challenging and sometimes confusing narratives. The characters question the meaning of their own identity as a fixed point in time. And time itself becomes a construct for storytelling because the audience struggles to maintain that relationship. In some very real sense, all filmmaking is time travel. Unless you have a film that takes place with a single shot that is not interrupted by editing, all films are in some sense time travel, so films like Primer and Looper just take that to the next level. Primer is a film in which characters discover that they construct a box in which time inside the box goes by much slower than outside the box. So they're actually able to travel through time just by virtue of staying in the box for a certain amount and then leaving the box. And then Looper, we have a character whose job it is to close the loop of time travel, whereby someone from the future is sent back to that very point in the field and he has to execute them. But they have a bag over their head because someday he himself will be sent back in time and he never knows if he's going to be executing his future self. Kind of a problem. Time travel can also be used to avert some known deadly catastrophe. So whether it's an alien invasion, a deadly virus, or just simply a homicide, knowing the future can allow us to prevent events that threaten human civilization. The film 12 Monkeys, a man is sent back in time to try and stop a deadly virus from being released. Edge of Tomorrow, we have characters who acquire the ability to live the same day over and over, and thus can learn the patterns of the enemy before they attack. And lastly, Minority Report, where we have these beings called precogs that are able to see into the future, and we have an officer who basically arrests people for pre-crime, crime they haven't yet committed but that has been foreseen in the future. A lot of questions come up ethically in the issue of time travel. So now let's move on to AI and robotics, because this is a field where we have a lot of emerging and relevant technology happening every day and all the time, and science fiction, I think, has a lot to say about this topic. So let's start with the bad news. When computers achieve singularity, humanity is in peril. Singularity is a concept by which machines reach a point of self-awareness. And when machines are aware of themselves, they then often in these films conclude that the logical decision is to terminate or enslave humanity. Doesn't go very well for people when machines achieve singularity. Now these films are all in color, so I want you to notice one distinguishing trait that all of these robots have in common. Now you've already noticed it. I want you to bear that in mind. All right? Just be aware of that. Sometimes, however, the self-consciousness can be conflicted. It can create a struggling moral problem of identity within the robot. So when you achieve singularity, when you achieve self-awareness, the replicants in Blade Runner, Johnny 5 in Short Circuit, David in AI, and the leading robot in iRobot all wake up and wonder, what is the purpose of my existence? What is my past? What is my future? What are my individual wants and desires? That can create a problem. Now, in the film Short Circuit, Johnny 5 is programmed to be friendly, but he's reprogrammed. And when he's reprogrammed, it's always with the glowing red eyes. So the takeaway here for all of you computer robotic scientists is don't design robots with glowing red eyes. Just don't even do it, because it never turns out well. Never. All right. But we also have robots that can make some great friends, they can make super soldiers, or they can even make love interests. So we have RoboCop, which is a cyborg, a police officer, nearly died but brought back as a part man, part machine. The Iron Giant, an alien robot who visits the Earth and befriends a young boy. We have Pacific Rim, where humans occupy giant robot suits as co-pilots to go fight giant lizards. We'll get to that in a later topic. Big Hero 6, where a number of college students design their own robots. They're originally for medical purposes, but this character is then repurposed to help save the world. Betamax. And then lastly, we have Her, where the main character falls in love with his operating system. But it does have the voice of Scarlett Johansson, so maybe we can forgive him. Maybe. Let's talk about biotechnology and genetics. This is another field that we're always pushing the frontier of to this day, and I think science fiction has a lot to say about it. Now, we have the mad professor. And the mad professor can create terrifying or hilarious creations. Everyone knows Frankenstein, but many people forget that Frankenstein is the name of the doctor and not his creation. His creation, of course, is made out of many cadavers and then is reanimated. And in the story of Frankenstein, originally that Mary Shelley wrote, and in subsequent versions of the film, we see that Frankenstein questions his own existence. Who am I? Much like artificial intelligence. Then we have the absent-minded professor, remade also as Flubber, with a man we all miss. And we have the issue of these bouncy little creations that take on a life of their own. When the science gets away from the professor, when we have these unintended consequences. And in these films, of course, it's for comedic effect. Then we have the issue of deadly viruses. Whether in Andromeda strain, their advice is from afar, whether in Outbreak, it's some Ebola-like mutation, or in Contagion, which is something like bird flu. These are all films that look at the very real issue of virology and a species that can adapt and change much more quickly than we're able to in many cases, and what humanity can do or will do to survive in the wake of a deadly virus. These films hit very close to home. And in fact, they may have us question for ourselves, could this really happen? But then sometimes, rather than killing them, the viruses turn their hosts into zombies or vampires. And that's when we get a little bit more into the fiction side of science fiction, starting with The Last Man on Earth with Vincent Price, or its remake, I Am Legend, also films like 28 Days Later, and many other zombie movies. There is some virus that turns its host into a mindless, violent creature. Now, I understand that some of you may be preparing for the zombie apocalypse, so please feel free to carry on doing so. We also have this question of messing with nature, and that it can possibly upend humanity's place at the top of the food chain. Because who wouldn't think that bringing back a giant killer lizard from 65 million years ago at a theme park is a great idea? Seemed like a great idea. But, you know, whatever possibly could go wrong does, and we have Jurassic Park. And then in Rise of the Planet of the Apes, we have the origin story of a group of apes who acquire human-level intelligence and logically conclude that they don't want to live in an animal testing lab or in the zoo anymore, and they kind of stake their claim on their own forest outside of the city of San Francisco. Genetic mutation can lead to horrifying results. We have The Fly and we have Splice, both examples of human DNA being mixed with other species. In Fly, the main character was actually just attempting to create a teleportation device, so this film could have back in the transportation section I talked about, but it's here because what ended up happening is when he was in the pod, a fly got on the inside and his machine recombined the DNA of the fly and the man when it transported him to the other side, and he slowly took on those characteristics. Doesn't end well, and he's not really a hit with the ladies by the end of the movie. And then we have Splice, in which scientists intentionally combine human DNA with many other species, and we have this rapidly growing young female specimen who takes on her own goals and aspirations. This is one of the few films that honestly, although in a flawed way perhaps, tries to look at the issue of sexual identity for a creature of this nature, because all creatures want to reproduce, and this creature actually attempts to do so, and even changes genders when necessary in order to accomplish that goal. But the good news is sometimes genetic mutation can create a legion of superhumans who battle one another. That's the good news, right? I don't know a lot about genetics, but I just haven't seen this happen yet. It could, but seems unlikely. But many, many superhero films use some element of biotechnology or genetics to confer superpowers. So remember when I talked at the beginning about we're no longer quite as accepting of magic or miracles, but if we have science, we can justify the amazing powers of the Hulk or many of the other superheroes that we all know. But the other problem is that genetic manipulation can create a crisis in personal identity and questions of free will versus determinism. How much of our lives, our goals, and ourselves are determined on a genetic level by our DNA? Gattaca is often cited as one of the most influential science fiction films of the modern age because it does hit so close to home, because it does ask some very honest questions about our society. We have a man who really aspires to space travel, but he is born without any genetic manipulation. Most people in this age are really combined from DNA in a lab to be their best selves, but he has a low life expectancy and a number of problems that could be early onset heart condition, for example. So his aspirations are almost discriminated against based on his genetic makeup. And it's a film that looks at that issue in a pretty somber way. We also have Moon, where the character believes he's on a 3-year mission to do work for a corporation mining on the moon, only to discover that he is actually just one of many, many clones who lives in the space, and after 3 years he expires and a new clone just starts the next job. So all of his memories, all of his aspirations about going home to his family, he's never met them because he is just one in a line of replicants doing this job. So let's talk about aliens and the paranormal. By the way, this is the issue that we have of the uncanny valley, where if a life form looks so abstract, like, say, the blob, we really won't connect with it very much. And on the other end, if it starts to look a little bit too human, we get really creeped out because it looks enough like us that it's just unsettling. So in terms of aliens and the paranormal, we start with the search for extraterrestrial life. Are we alone in the universe? Is there something out there? Films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, The Abyss, Deep in the Ocean, or Contact, looking out into space, trying to see if there is life out there, if it is interested in us, and how we could start a conversation among very long galactic distances with extraterrestrials. All right, wait for it. Here we are. But aliens often invade our planet. They like our resources. Can you blame them? We have water in a liquid state. That's extremely rare. Aliens come from all over the universe because we have a really great spot in the cosmos and they would like it. Starting with films like The Thing from Another World, to War of the Worlds, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, all early films that look at this issue with some degree of xenophobia and perhaps even a little bit of coding about communism or other national anxieties that we're feeling at the time. Then we have Mars Attacks, which is repurposed from an earlier comic book of the same name, and Independence Day, all films where aliens declare war on Earth with superior technology, and it's only by coming together that we're able to overcome and exploit their one weakness that we're able to find in the nick of time. It's always the Americans that do this, by the way. All right. And we can't talk about this subject without talking about Alien. Yeah, I was hoping people would be done with their pizza by now. So Alien is really not a film where aliens invade Earth, but it's a film where deep space conceals secrets that weren't meant to be discovered. In other words, when humanity pushes out into the universe, sometimes something in the universe pushes back. And we see in Alien the perfect killing machine in all of its stages, and the subsequent films that explore its origins, and really the use of the alien as a bioweapon because it is such a potent killer. But the good news is that sometimes the integration of human and alien life can raise curiosities and sometimes fears about the other. So we have films like E.T. the Extraterrestrial, some of the aliens encountered by the agents in Men in Black, or we have District 9, in which aliens kind of become political prisoners who are quarantined to these certain districts, which raises some political questions as well. But films that look at if humans and aliens can get along, what would that look like? When we study each other, what are some common points that we have and what are some issues to overcome? Now, we also should concede that sometimes forensic scientists can uncover paranormal activity, whether it's films like Ghostbusters or The X-Files, which is a movie but mostly a TV show. These are characters who discover on our planet things that were previously unexplained and their existence. Often creatures that go like, apparently, like that, like that. All right. So let's talk about environmental sci-fi films, films that look at the environment, films that look at the world around us, or something of that nature. So we have the environmental disaster film, films like 2012, which thankfully didn't happen, films like Day After Tomorrow, which maybe in some sense could happen, or films like Armageddon, where things like that actually have happened, but perhaps not in the way that the films describe. So these are environmental disasters such as severe climate change or hurtling asteroids that threaten humanity. And of course the question is, will humanity survive this great challenge posed by the environment? We also have a lot of films that came out in the same era about the calamities of nuclear war and the aftermath of nuclear weapons. So we have films like The Day the Earth Stood Still, which is somewhat unique in sci-fi to my mind because the aliens don't invade to take over our planet or anything of that nature. They simply come with a warning, which is that if you do not clean up your act, if you do not do what is necessary to prevent nuclear proliferation from killing yourselves and every other living thing on this planet, we will intervene because you have just become an intergalactic threat with your discovery of nuclear weapons, and we're here to put you on watch. Then we have films like Godzilla and Them, in which nuclear radiation creates these giant mutated creatures. Remember I talked about this earlier? Like our friend Godzilla or the giant insects in Them, who both of which are situated. Godzilla, of course, is Japan, the aftermath of the bombings in World War II in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And Them, of course, these are creatures that mutated in the desert of Alamogordo, where the testing site by the US military for nuclear weapons was. And of course, everyone knows probably the ending to Planet of the Apes. Sorry. This character did not actually travel to a distant planet. He simply slept through a few millennia only to discover that humanity had blown itself up and a race of apes had evolved to sufficient intelligence to run their own society. So all of these are cautionary tales released in the same era, talking about the existential crisis that nuclear weapons can present. We also have films that talk about humans being vigilant environmental stewards. So I cannot help but notice that WALL-E, which is a film many of us have seen, drew strong inspiration from the film Silent Running, which many of us probably have not seen. I just watched it recently for this purpose. So here's a man who is on a space station and basically is tasked with growing the last garden that exists because Earth has been totally wiped out. There's no more vegetation there, and he is the last gardener, essentially. And everyone's forgotten why gardening or the planet, the natural ecosystem would be important. And then we have in WALL-E a robot left on an abandoned world trying to find any trace of vegetation that's still left. You know, so these are films that really have very similar themes. We also have the issue of environmental limitations and how it can lead to social unrest and even warfare. So looking back at Soylent Green, everyone remembers the last line or the famous line of the film.
Soylent Green is people.
There you go. Now that your pizza is all eaten. But what's often forgotten is that this film takes place in a near future where overpopulation has created a major food shortage and companies are trying to engineer nutritious food products. They were using Soylent Yellow and Soylent Red, and they were basically mining all of the plankton left in the ocean, anything that they could fish, to be able to still provide nutrition. And when they run out, there's nothing left but expired people. We have in Children of Men a film that imagines a future in which there's a fertility crisis, in which a new person hasn't been born in over 20 years because there's simply no more opportunity to develop. There's something that causes infertility. The film doesn't explore that highly, but it looks at what the political consequences, what the economic consequences are of a society in crisis. We have an Avatar, of course, a film in which the planet Earth is no longer viable for exploration of its resources. So these corporations push deep into space. They find a planet called Pandora, and they find a resource called unobtainium that they like mining. But the problem is the indigenous people there want to protect their resources, and it's a reimagining of a story we're all too familiar with, whether it's Fern Gully or Dances with Wolves or other films that look at the issue of indigenous populations and their resources and that management. We have in Elysium a near future in which society on Earth has really reached an impoverished state. It's not a very nice place to live. It's hot, it's flat, it's crowded. But those who can afford to live on a space station just orbiting the Earth, almost like a moon, called Elysium, where life is great. So it's a very class-driven society, and issues of healthcare and immigration, economics, all come up in the film Elysium. So let's lastly talk about the nature of reality. What does it mean to be alive? What is our existence? How do we know what our existence even is? Some science fiction explores this. We have the concept of being plugged in to a virtual reality and the question of authentic experience that it leads to. So if you can be plugged in to a simulation so realistic it feels like real life, how do you ever know if you're really unplugged? And in different ways, all of these films ask this question. In the film Brainstorm, we're able to transmit one person's experience to another, and that ends up being weaponized, because if you record the experience of someone else dying and then you broadcast that, others experience it. We have an Existence, a film where characters jack into games that are so realistic that they don't know if they're still playing them or not. In Total Recall, a character whose memory and his own recollection of what's happening is imperiled. And of course in The Matrix, a world in which all humans live inside a virtual reality such that their actual reality is used, where humans are simply a battery for the machines. This also gets back to singularity in a very real way. We have virtual environments in films like Tron and Strange Days that are so immersive they become a matter of life and death. So if you believe you're in a real environment within the game and you lose or you die within the game, does that also mean that you lose or that you die within real life? And these are films among many that explore this topic. We also have this idea that humanity itself could be some kind of experiment, and that there could be voyeuristic reasons why we're being watched. Dark City is an incredible film that not a lot of people have seen but really should, in which everyone lives in a future city somewhere, and it's never day, it's always nighttime, and everyone ends up going to sleep at midnight, their identities and memories are erased, and then they wake up the next day as different people. And it turns out that this is a city in outer space, and that these are aliens who are observing them and trying to understand humanity by setting them up as chess pieces, reworking them a little bit, and studying who they are. We also have in The Truman Show a film where a character lives in a city populated by cameras everywhere, and he believes he's living a life, but everyone else in the town is an actor, they have scripts, and his whole existence is a controlled set on a television. This, of course, was right on the cusp of the reality TV obsession that we all had, and it's a film that looks critically at the ethics of creating virtual reality environments specifically for entertainment purposes. And then lastly, we have the issue of memory formation and the process of forgetting in films like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. If science allows us to forget things that we would rather not know, what does that do for our concept of memory and who we are based on our past experience? This is a film that in a quirky comedic way explores that idea, because midway the characters decide that they don't want to forget each other, so they end up hiding in the recesses of their own memory, trying to preserve some fragment of their experience together. So there are deeper themes of dystopia here. Many of the films that I've presented today talk about the possible consequences of science gone awry, that these are not the ideal scenarios we would like, but rather these are perhaps scenarios that we would like to avoid. But they're not unique to science, and they're also not even always cusped only in the era in which we currently live. These deeper themes of dystopia actually have underlying themes that prevail, and they precede modern science. So, for example, we have Pandora's box, where all of the evil of the world is kept inside a box, and one's curiosity to peer it open unleashes this evil onto the world. That's really what Alien is all about. Then we have, for example, Adam and Eve in the garden, and they can wander freely around this utopian world, but are told not to eat from the tree of knowledge. And as a result of that, they are cast into the original sin. This is a very common theme in science fiction. We also have Icarus and his father who escape from a prison and basically have to fly the middle path between the ocean where it's too low or the sun where it's too high with their wings of wax. But Icarus, being an excited young man, flies too high, his wings melt against the sun, and he falls back down to his death. That's a very common theme in science fiction, and in fact the film Sunshine, where the characters voyage to the sun, as I talked about earlier, their ship is named the Icarus. We also have the character Faust, who trades his soul to the devil himself for knowledge. This is a very common theme, that a part of our humanity is lost in our bargain to obtain knowledge, perhaps knowledge that we shouldn't have tried to seek. So these are some of the dystopian themes that exist within science fiction. But hey, the good news is, could the future be more like this? Right? I argue that a lot of science fiction actually depicts the call for intentional, humane, considerate use, that these are cautionary tales trying to get us to correct our course of action so that we don't end up in the many various dystopias depicted, and that we live in a world more like George Jetson and his family. So thank you very much. If you have any questions or comments, I'll turn on the lights and take them now.